Kia ora again, everyone. Good evening. My name is Matthew Bartlett. It's very lovely to have you here. I'm one of the chaplains here at Victoria University. Welcome to the chaplaincy. There are 7 Christian chaplains at the university. Their lovely faces are here. At some point, we'll get Maty to pose with us for a proper group photo, but for the time being, she's photoshopped in. The chaplains here at Victoria offer confidential pastoral care to anyone who needs it, regardless of background. We have a chapel down the hall that people can pray in if they need to. In fact, there's a little prayer station set up there for Ukraine presently, if that's your sort of thing. We have worship services and contemplative prayer and affordable coffee and tea and snacks and occasional events like these. And one of the first things I need to do is apologise. I had lined up the wonderful Sophie Crawford, who's recently finished her Masters in Strategic Studies, to chair this evening, but someone in her household got COVID a week ago, or less than a week ago, and so her household was isolated. So instead of Sophie, you've got me. So you may get a slightly more naive and unsophisticated take on things, but we'll sort of do the best we can with that. Tiny bit of framing. Someone asked me, why is the Christian chaplaincy hosting an event like this? And for me, it's particularly about trying to understand the big picture of the world. So what's going on, how to make sense of the global picture, and particularly Aotearoa's particular place in that picture. Trying to understand how we can make some kind of wise contribution. The Christian story, as I understand it, at the widest possible angle, says that the world was created out of love and has a destiny of peace. But in the meantime, there's enormous amounts of ambiguity, complexity, conflict at all levels. And trying to understand how we live wisely and understand wisely in amongst that is what this is all about, from my point of view. We'll see where we get to by the end of it. So now to introduce our first speaker, Maty Nikkhou-O'Brien. I hope I've said your name correctly. Was the first woman executive director of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs. She has an MSc in International Relations from the London School of Economics and an MA in Oriental Studies from the French Institute of Oriental Studies. Maty is executive director of Diplosphere, and I believe this evening she'll be speaking on the historical context and the lessons of history regarding the war in Ukraine. Thank you, Maty.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much for having me here. And it's a pleasure to see a full house this evening. I knew that the hand outstretched to me was the same hand that held the knife, that held the gun, the hand that gave the order to shoot, to kill. Of all the hands in the world, it was not the hand that I wanted or dreamed of touching. On that world stage, I stood as a representative of a state that is willing to give peace a chance. As I have said, one does not make peace with one's friends. One makes peace with one's enemy, noted Isaac Rabin in his memoir with reference to shaking hands with Yasser Arafat in Washington, the 13th September, 1993. Thank you very much for organizing this event. As Matthew mentioned, I'm the director and founder of Diplosphere. So Diplosphere is a non-partisan organization with a mission to promote independent thinking and diplomacy. We shed light on world events and bring perspectives, as you were talking about, so that New Zealanders may be better informed and make better decisions. Perspectives are needed this evening as the current situation in Ukraine is far from being a black and white issue, as often portrayed in the public discourse. They say the first casualty of war is the truth, and this certainly applies here. The fog of war makes analysis tricky, and the views I'm expressing are through this lens and via a series of experts who think independently, to my view. Much is still contested. And of course, the history of Ukraine is rich and complex. It will not run through, I will not run through key dates, but focus on recent past. But some salient points. Ukraine as an independent nation is a young country. It used to be part of the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, for over 300 years, before independence in 1991. Ukraine and Russia have a long intertwined history. Now, on this issue, opinion worldwide is nearly unanimous. Russia is the aggressor. The Russian army's attack on Ukraine is a flagrant violation of international law and the United Nations Charter. And we can all agree tonight that everything is happening in Ukraine, all the humanitarian situation is deplorable. As prominent US academic Andrew Bacevich said, even in a secular age, we know whose side God is on. The constant stream of images of blight, death, and destructions in Ukraine that we see in the media increases the desire for revenge, more sanctions, and further military measures against Russia. But Bacevich, who also served in the US Army and lost his son fighting in the Iraq War, warns that snap judgment rarely stands the test of history. Indeed, moral indignation can be a dangerous compass. World War I illustrates well that point. Germany began fighting World War I until France invading France through neutral Belgium in the west and confronting Russia in the east. At the end of the war, the victorious allies charged Germany with war guilt. Germany was humiliated. But this judgment accomplished little apart from setting the stage for an even more disastrous conflict 2 decades later. Moral indignation and poor judgment can lead to unintended grave consequences. The same may apply here. I am going to talk about 2 important questions that need to be addressed to my view. First, why did Putin decide to send his troops to Ukraine? And second, why Ukraine's message has been less compelling to the non-Western world. Headlines in New Zealand mainstream media make us think everyone else is on the same page, but this is not the case. So first, why this crisis? Looking back at the origins of the Ukrainian crisis is not only useful in helping understand how we got there, but also in considering how we might get out of it. We need to understand Putin's motives for sending in troops to invade Ukraine. This should be easy, as he has often spoken about his motivation. Yet, 6 or even 3 months ago, no one imagined that the Russian army would invade Ukraine, not even President Zelensky. There are 2 opposing schools of thought here. One holds that Putin is reacting to the West's ongoing contempt for his security concerns, as NATO, reneging on previous commitments, got closer to his borders. For years, Russia has highlighted its fears that NATO will set up camp on its borders, breaching non-expansion commitments the US made when the Soviet Union split apart. Back then, discussions and promises were made by the West not to move eastward, including the famous quote by the US Secretary of State James Baker, "not one inch eastward." But these promises were not written. There is no agreement about that. And there are different interpretations. Professor John Eikenberry notes that it is not only the NATO expansion, but also the EU expansion to Ukraine and the possibility of another color revolution in Ukraine, which could lead to a color revolution in Russia, in Russia itself, which is seen as a threat. The overthrow of our elected pro-Russian President Yanukovych in 2014 and Maidan Square protests reinforce this fear. The other school of thought, with opposing views, believes that the lack of response to a series of aggressive acts and the opportunities that gave him to re-establish Russia's former sphere of influence encouraged Putin's expansionism. Thus, it is not the growing US presence on Russia's borders that explains even partly the Russian offensive, but the fact that NATO denied Kiev the military means to deter its powerful neighbor. According to this theory, The West's fault is not NATO enlargement, but allowing Putin to intervene in Georgia, then Syria, then Crimea. That is the West being too soft. Nevertheless, according to Serge Halimi, president of the prestigious monthly paper Le Monde Diplomatique, while the first theory can be backed up with historical documents, the second, more favored by the neoconservatives, relies on psychologizing dictators' behavior. He also argues that this discourse is dangerous, as it is by definition irrefutable. That is, neocons can always claim that a defeat could have been a victory if action had been taken earlier or more forcefully. It is also argued that this strategy could have been avoided. Most experts acknowledge that the Bush administration was playing with fire in 2008 when it held out at the Bucharest summit the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO, despite opposition from France and Germany. This attitude was all the more reckless given that in Munich the previous year, Putin had expressed his concern that, I'm quoting, NATO has put its frontline forces on our borders, yet we do not react to these actions at all. Professor John Eikenberry notes that great powers worry about the security. Great powers naturally tend to equate their security with the defense of their zones of influence, by force if necessary. As Senator Bernie Sanders pointed out on 10th of February, even if Russia was not ruled by a corrupt authoritarian leader like Vladimir Putin, Russia, like the United States, would still have an interest in the security policies of its neighbors. Does anyone really believe that the United States would not have something to say if Mexico was to form a military alliance with an adversary from the United States? And incidentally, this was illustrated in our region last week when senior US officials directly warned the sovereign country of the Solomon Islands and the Prime Minister that the US will respond if a Chinese military base is built on the Pacific island nation. So in summary, the two schools of thought are from the realists looking to defensive logic of a great power, or neocons and liberal interventionists declaiming the West as being too soft. Or there are elements of both at play. Now, the second question to raise is why the Western narrative may not be shared by the rest of the world. The United Nations General Assembly of the 2nd of March, condemning Russia's aggression, was not passed unanimously. 141 in favor to 5 against, including Belarus, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Eritrea, Russian Federation, and Syria, and 35 abstentions, including China, India, Pakistan, South Africa, and many more. Although a majority of countries backed it, 53% of the vote measured by world population did not. Western mainstream media have been far beyond just informing us. They have taken side, but in the rest of the world, Ukraine is seen differently. But why? There is certainly the fear of economic dependence and vulnerability vis-à-vis Russia, but others also consider this is double standards and Western hypocrisy, not because they don't care about the Ukrainian plight, but because they consider it hypocritical for Westerners to be indignant today about the sorts of crimes they committed yesterday, such as the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, in which 15 of the EU's 27 member states took part. Prominent US analyst Shrita Parsi tells journalist Christian Amonpour that there is a strong global consensus that Russia is the aggressor, But when the West frames this issue as a battle for the rules-based order, they lose a lot of the global South. Example, US withdrew from the United Nations Human Rights Council and sanctioned senior officials of the International Criminal Court for seeking to investigate American war crimes in Afghanistan. The Biden administration is calling for the court to investigate Russian war crimes in Ukraine. The global South recognizes that double standards in the world order cannot be fully eradicated, but they are not on board with making painful sacrifices by sanctioning Russia in order to sustain a unipolar US-led order. Not joining the US-EU's Russia sanctions does not mean that the global South prefers a Russian or a Chinese-led order. The choices between the unipolar order of the past, which covered 1990s up to now, or a multipolar order, which we now enter for the foreseeable future. I can very suggest that the first thing that the US must do is to reestablish itself as the foremost supporter of the global systems that underpin the Western order. I finish with these words I started with. One does not make peace with one's friends, one makes peace with one's enemies. There's more to diplomacy than devising sanctions, and as a small nation in the South Pacific, should New Zealand consider this when devising policy as we adjust to a multipolar world? Thank you.
Thank you, Maty. John Allen is the Chancellor here at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, and CEO of Wellington, New Zealand. Before this, John was the Secretary and CEO of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade between 2009 and 2015. This evening, John will give an overview of Aotearoa's place in the world and the impact of conflict on the multilateral international order and the potential implications for New Zealand.
Kia ora tātou, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm not the expert. I've got two experts on each side of me. I'm a former member of the Foreign Affairs community. I'm a Hamilton boy with aspirations, I suppose you might say, and they've got me this far. Can I start by just picking up a couple of the themes that Maty has introduced? First, her opening stanza, which was about handshaking. And I thought about that as you were saying it and thought I've shaken the hand of Vladimir Putin. And I did that in Vladivostok at an APEC conference with John Key some years ago. And we were waiting to see President Putin for some time because he doesn't keep a particularly timely approach to his appointments. And after an hour, we were thinking of leaving and sort of reorganizing ourselves. And we got the call that President Putin would now see us, but was in a different room than we had been told. And as a consequence of that, we actually had to run through a labyrinth of corridors in this complex in Vladivostok to meet President Putin. President Putin wasn't at all what I had expected. He was shorter to start with, but he was also far more human. He was relaxed, he was funny, he was engaging and engaged in the conversation with our small party in a day in which he'd seen, no doubt, multiplicities of more important international players. And I tell you that story only because, one, I suppose we were negotiating a trade agreement at the time, and we were thinking about a trade agreement with Russia, and that was what this conversation was about. That never went anywhere, of course, because of some of the activity that Maty's already talked about, which meant we couldn't progress. But I tell you that because it's very easy to demonize people, and it's very easy to take a view that somebody is all black. And right at the moment, it's hard not to see Vladimir Putin through that lens. All I can say to you is that in the occasion in which we engaged with him, we saw a very different and more human person than was suggested is suggested in some of that narrative. The second is the observation about the Treaty of Versailles and how that impacted on the Second World War, and this question of respect for nations and how respect or disrespect of nations can impact future decision-making. And as you said that, I was thinking about 1992, and I was thinking about the disestablishment of the Soviet Union and on the New Year's Day, 1992, and there down came the flag, the sickle, and the hammer and sickle flag of the USSR, and up went the Tsarist tricolour that was now for the Russian Federation. And just thinking about that time, and as Maty said, right from the get-go, Boris Yeltsin, who was president of Russia at that time, was warning the West about NATO expansionism. Right at that time, he was warning the West about the need for the West to inject capital into his country, to support his country, to enable the country to be successful in the way perhaps the Marshall Plan had after the Second World War. And of course, the West and its triumphalism and believing that history had ended in Francis Fukuyama's famous words, and that we had won, we being we're sort of Western, we're other actually in the UN context, but nonetheless, that we had won, of course, just rejected all of that, believing Russia had had its day, was past its prime, was going to sink into relative anonymity. And I think a lot of what I see in President Putin is a need for respect. And so I think that's important to think about when we think about the context for what we're currently confronting. And then the third thing was just a reference to history. And I think the history of this is fascinating. I'm not a deep expert in it as Maty is. But the thing that I think is fascinating is President Putin's statement that there is no such thing as Ukraine. And that's taken as a view that there's no right for Ukraine to exist. I don't think that's what he means. I think what he means, and this is a very well-held and historically held view of Russian leadership, is that there is a greater Russian community, and that greater Russian community involves Greater Russia, which is the primary piece of Russia that we now see as the Russian Federation. It involves Little Russia, as they call Ukraine in that context, and it involves White Russia, which is what they're referring to when they talk about Belarus in that context. And so even if you go back to the Paris conference after, after
1990.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Dates have never been my thing. Conferences are quite good when you're a diplomat. So the Paris conference, even the Paris conference, the Russian representative said, there is no such thing as Ukraine. Ukraine is a foreign construct. There is just Little Russia and Greater Russia and White Russia. And so that view about that the sort of Russian identity and the place of Ukraine in that identity, I think is a part of what is propelling Mr. Putin forward. Of course, it is fair to say that there's always been, or for many centuries now, ambitions for independence from within Ukraine. And there have been multiplicities of occasions when that has seen has flared up, often supported actually by other powers. Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, in the 19th century, supporting independence movements within Ukraine with a view to helping disestablish, set back Russia. And so this idea that Ukraine can be used as a mechanism to impact Russia is not a new idea. It's an idea that we've seen previously in history. And I think when people listened to Secretary Austin in Kiev the other day, when he was there saying, look, what we need to do is to ensure that the Russian capability is so diminished that they can never invade, a country ever again. They can never repeat this aggression. The way in which that will have been interpreted by many is, well, what that means is we're going to have a long war, because that's how you degrade Russia's capability in that way, at the expense largely of the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians are the meat and the sandwich yet again in that sort of battle. And that the actual effort that goes into peacemaking is going to be significantly lowered in that context. So there's just, I thought that was a really interesting series of observations. Thank you. I just sort of riffing off that a bit in a few sort of oblique references. I'm meant to be talking about the place of New Zealand in the world, and how this catastrophe 17,000 kilometres away impacts New Zealand. And as Maty said, we're a small nation. David Longy once famously described us as shaped like an arrow, strategically positioned, thrusting at the heart of Antarctica, by which I think he meant we're largely irrelevant. Although now Antarctica is being unlocked, perhaps not as irrelevant as David thought. So what does it mean for a small country when this sort of activity starts occurring, and what's the impact for us? And I think actually the starting point is a comment that Maty made as well, which is about the rules-based order. Because as a small country, which is dependent on trade and engaging with other countries across the world for our livelihood and our existence, the rules-based order is fundamental to our success. And so when you see the giants begin to play, when the tectonic plates are beginning to shake, it makes our task in doing that much harder. And if you look at the UN, and I take the vote, as you said, at 141, was it? 141.35, no,
yes,
141.5,
yes.
141.538, that's right. So 141.538. And you can say to yourself, my word, isn't that splendid? And we've talked, Maty's talked about the number of countries versus the size of populations and the actual impacts of that. But the true fact is that the GA has absolutely no authority to make anything happen as a consequence of that vote. The true fact is that Russia can sit behind its veto, China can sit behind a veto, and they can ensure that this body that was set up, if you read the preamble to the Constitution of the UN, though many of you will be able to recite it, I know, but it was to ensure that successive generations were not exposed to the scourge of war, to ensure that successive generations were not exposed to the scourge of war. And here is this body, which is the crucible of the rules-based order in our world at the moment, completely unable to deal with exactly that issue because of a fundamental failure in the architecture of the UN. And that fundamental failure, I can tell you, was called out by New Zealand at the San Francisco conference in 1945, at which the necessary declarations and constitutions were signed. We have been an opponent of that veto forever. And I think what this is demonstrating is that we are right. But the fact that the world order the systems of the world are currently vulnerable and currently ineffective makes the task of New Zealand in engaging with the world much, much more challenging. And so you will see a focus, I don't doubt, on trade agreements and all those sorts of things. You will see a focus on us trying to corral like-minded countries and like-minded organisations to try and advance against this uncertainty, but it is extraordinarily difficult for us to be able to do so. We pride ourselves on having something we call an independent foreign policy, And what we mean by an independent foreign policy is we're a trusted broker, we're friends with everyone likes us, and therefore we're able to be, in the middle of everything, a conduit between warring nations and difficult situations and all those sorts of things. And we pride ourselves in that position. It's damn hard to be a trusted broker, small country, in an environment that we are in at the moment. And interestingly, you've seen New Zealand make choices that I think, and it doesn't surprise me we've made these choices, but very, very clearly identify us with the WEOG group, with the Western group, in a way that we have been trying for quite a long time to just delicately distance ourselves. And I mean Nanaia Mahuta attending virtually the NATO conference around this. I mean the sanctions legislation which has gone through our parliament, which has made a significant difference. I mean the fact that New Zealand's been prepared to put funding behind potential purchase of lethal aid for Ukraine. And I'm not arguing about whether that's a wise thing or not a wise thing. All I'm saying is that is reflecting a very different position for this country than we've been trying to position ourselves in for quite some time. And so I think when you look at this and think about the impacts of this, you've got to start thinking about what that means long term for this country as we move forward. I had another couple of exciting points to raise with you, which I thought I would. Oh, I know the next one. Sorry. The next one is quite simple, and we've already talked about what's happening in the Solomons. You are going to see countries around the planet investing massive money back into military capabilities. And New Zealand will be no exception. New Zealand will be no exception. So you will see this country, you've already seen actually, there's one political party I think that's come out and said we need to be spending 2% of GDP on our military. You will see this country alongside our Australian friends and alongside Singapore and alongside Southeast Asia, which has been spending, the growth in spending in military assets in Southeast Asia has been huge in the last period. This will be a defining event that will see significant expenditure in those assets. And the reason that people are doing that is because what Ukraine is demonstrating is if you don't do that, you're going to get clobbered. Now, how effective the expenditure is a real debate. I'm not advocating for it, I'm just telling you that it is coming. And so from my point of view, when I think about the impacts for New Zealand in this, while you can say, the world is more fragile, it should create opportunities for us because there should be opportunities for us to be able to build new alliances and all those sorts of things. The truth of it is this is a much more dangerous place for New Zealand to be. The last point that I wanted to make is to look at what Russia has been doing with oil and using its strategic asset in oil to basically leverage, divide, and influence and shape European opinion. And the reason that's important is because what we're seeing in response to this is countries taking a real interest in sovereign control of strategically important assets. And so oil obviously is one of those and gas is one of those. But here's the thing from New Zealand's point of view, food is one of those. And so we pride ourselves on being a nation that exports food around the world. Well, right now in countries like Singapore, for example, and there are many others, they are investing billions and billions and billions of dollars in ensuring that they can, in their laboratories, produce sufficient food for their people. And that will be replicated in many other parts of the world. So whereas we think about a free trade sort of environment as being the thing that will enable us to be successful, countries are increasingly saying, if you need agricultural, if you want to eat, you better have your food near home. And you don't want to be reliant on supply chains that go through the South China Sea to get to our market. So look, these are all features, in my view, that are complications, challenges for this country at this time. And I think, we are, as was said right at the beginning, we're a long way from the lion or the tiger lying down with the kid, that sort of Isaiah principle of what a true and perfect and peaceful world might be. But I think we will still have aspirations to get there.
Thank you very much, John. I won't stand up. It's awkward being the only one who does. Jonathan Boston, do you wish to stand or sit?
I will stand.
Oh, are you?
Can I will stand to introduce you?
I need to stand. These seats aren't very comfortable.
I'm sorry. I chose them. I'm sorry. Jonathan is Professor of Public Policy in the School of Government here at Te Herenga Waka. He has been the Director of the University's Institute for Governance and Policy Studies. He sits on the governance boards of several organisations, including Oxfam New Zealand. Jonathan will talk about the ethics of war and peace from a Christian perspective and consider the arguments for and against pacifism and the idea of the just war in relation to this particular conflict. Thank you, Jonathan. I have your slides. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, kia ora, everyone. Thank you, Matthew, for your kind invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to share a platform with the Chancellor and with Maty. And thank you all for coming. I have some slides and I have a handout. Unfortunately, I was pessimistic in my expectations of the turnout. So Nikkhou is going to hand out one between two. So at least it saved the university's photocopying budget. All right. The war between Russia and Ukraine, as Maty and John have highlighted, raises a very wide range of profound questions. And as Matthew has said, I'm going to focus on some of the crucial ethical or moral issues, and we'll do so from an explicitly Christian perspective. I make no claims to be an expert on the ethics of war, but I have, I trust, at least some grasp of the critical issues and why over many centuries, Christian theologians, ethicists, and lay people have disagreed about the ethics of war. And I realize there are people in the audience here who are widely read on the subject area. So I will brace myself for questions later. So first, let me be very clear. Wars are evil. They involve great suffering, huge damage to buildings and infrastructure, and enormous costs, both financial and non-financial. But not all wars are equally unjust. Some are clearly, profoundly wrong, but others are less so, and possibly the lesser of two evils. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia on the 25th of February, 65 days ago, is clearly a shocking event in multiple ways. And I'm sure many of us just felt, emotionally really sick when we read the news or heard the news of this invasion. Russia's aggression is clearly unprovoked, unjustified, illegal and morally wrong. And about this, in my view, there can be no doubt. Moreover, its conduct of the war has been barbaric, with massive violations of international humanitarian law, indiscriminate killing and abuse of large numbers of innocent civilians, including children, and enormous damage to Ukraine's economy, physical infrastructure, cultural treasures, and ecology. Am I able to move this on?
I can move it.
Oh,
gesture me in.
Right. Okay. If you just run through the next, that just gives you an outline of what I'm going to cover. And these are just some of the many, many horrific shots you will have seen, photographs you will have seen. The damage bill already exceeds US $1 trillion and is mounting daily. Over 12 million people have been displaced, many of them outside of Ukraine. And the ripple effects globally will be huge, with increased poverty, political instability, geopolitical tensions, greater repression, more money spent on military, as John has indicated, and so on and so forth. So one of the questions that faces many of us as Christians is, what do we say about such things? Is Ukraine justified in countering Russia's invasion? Is this a case of justified self-defense, a just war? Or should Ukraine, as some may say, simply have let Russia take over their country, a country which, as a number have indicated, is relatively recent in terms of an independent sovereign state? As I'm sure most of you are aware, two different moral positions have dominated Christian perspectives on war: pacifism and the just war tradition. There has also been a holy war tradition, which justified the use of force to spread the Christian faith, as demonstrated by the Crusades of the Middle Ages, but that has been very much a minority and disreputable view for many centuries. If pacifism is an expression of Christian idealism, just war advocates are typically Christian realists. Leading Christian pacifists over the past century or so have included people like John Howard Yoder, a Mennonite, who wrote The Politics of Jesus, which I remember reading as an undergraduate, Richard Hayes, a theologian at Duke University, who's written a fantastic book called The Moral Vision of the New Testament, and Stanley Hauerwas, also at Duke University, who wrote a book some years ago, which I remember reading, called The Peaceable Kingdom. And I had the pleasure of meeting Stanley briefly when I was at Duke some years ago. All three writers, theologians, have influenced my thinking as a Christian, but for reasons I will outline shortly, I am not a pacifist. Pacifism, at least in its classical form, involves an absolute opposition to and a refusal to use any kind of violent or lethal force under any circumstances. This is because all intentional killing is deemed to be murder, and murder is evil. Hence, all warfare and violence is strictly forbidden. It is absolutely and unconditionally wrong. This includes personal or national self-defense and the use of violence to defend justice, such as protecting the innocent. The theological basis for pacifism, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, at least within the Christian tradition, lies in the words and deeds of Jesus Christ, as revealed through the four gospel accounts. And sort of very briefly, pacifists will typically argue, first, that Jesus consistently rejected the use of force or physical violence, as demonstrated, for example, through his rejection during the temptations in the wilderness of the idea of becoming a military messiah, notwithstanding the then Roman occupation of Israel and the unjust oppression of his Jewish kinsfolk. Likewise, Jesus rebuked his disciple Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane when Peter took up a sword to protect Jesus from arrest. But above all, people will refer to the crucifixion of Jesus as providing the absolute kind of ethical norm, better to suffer an injustice than to resist evil violently. Next, Christians will point not merely to Jesus' deeds, but also to his words, arguing that he consistently espoused self-giving, non-violent love, not least in the famous Sermon on the Mount recorded in Matthew's Gospel. Do not resist one who is evil, love your enemies, forgive your enemies, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. The conclusion from the words and deeds of Jesus, very simply for Christians, is that if we are to be followers of Christ, we must reject the use of lethal force. This is the model, not just indeed for Christians, but for all humanity. Killing one's enemies is incompatible with neighbor love. God's kingdom is a non-coercive, non-violent, peaceable kingdom. And our response to adversity and violent aggression should be to endure the suffering, not to retaliate, and to trust that our actions will ultimately be vindicated by God in the future. And I'm reminded in this context, many years ago, as a student in the 1970s, going to hear a person called Bishop Festo Kabenjeri, who was a Ugandan bishop who had to flee the terror of Idi Amin, a dictator in Uganda who was responsible for the deaths of many, many thousands of Ugandans, including the Archbishop, the Anglican Archbishop of Uganda. And Kabenjeri said, and he was a pacifist, he said, if I had been in the presence of Idi Amin and I'd been handed a gun, he said, I would have handed the gun to Idi Amin and said to him, this is your weapon. Mine is the weapon of love. it is hard not to respect the pacifist position and to feel the moral force of what Bishop Festo Kavengere said. But I think he was profoundly wrong. If I had been handed a gun in the presence of Idi Amin, I hope I would have had the courage to have said, "You are responsible for crimes against humanity. I'm putting you under arrest. If you resist, I will shoot you." And to do that as a Christian in the name of love. So why is pacifism wrong from a Christian standpoint? Here are a few quick reasons. First, the Old and New Testament both affirm the important role for public authorities, i.e. the state, as a mechanism in the face of evil and private violence to ensure order, to protect life, to protect the innocent, and to enable people to flourish and live in peace. For the state to survive and fulfill its responsibilities, it must have a monopoly on the use of lethal force, as we witnessed tragically outside Parliament a few weeks ago. Otherwise, power will shift to warlords, gangs, and other people prepared to use violence. So the police and the military forces of a nation must be willing and must be empowered to use lethal weapons to fulfill their roles, albeit under appropriate limitations. Second, the Bible places a huge emphasis on the pursuit of justice, both social justice, corrective justice, and restorative justice. Christians have a moral obligation to challenge injustice, to protect the innocent. And sometimes this will not be possible without the threat and indeed the use of physical and lethal force. Third, while the biblical witness is open to a variety of interpretations, including a pacifist interpretation, it seems to me there is no absolute prohibition on the use of force. And we can point to numerous references in the New Testament where Jesus or John the Baptist affirmed military figures and made no suggestion that they should renounce their military service or that their service in the military was incompatible with discipleship of Christ. Fourth, the ideal of pure, disinterested, non-violent love, in my view, cannot constitute a practical, viable, and adequate social ethic in a world characterized by the tragic quality that we witness today in many parts of the world. Now, this is not to suggest that love is irrelevant. Love is critically important. It must qualify justice with mercy. But we need to recognize that love for neighbor can sometimes require taking lethal force to protect those whom we love and are required to show love to. And finally, in my view, pacifism is inconsistent. It effectively involves condemning violence, but at the same time condoning a coercive role for the state and enjoying the benefits of this coercion, in effect letting others get their hands dirty while seeking to keep one's own hands clean. So, sorry for that rather long, I might say, diatribe against pacifism, but I think it is relevant in the current context because as we moved sort of beyond history in the 1990s and so on, I think many people, and particularly many Christians, have sort of thought, oh yes, well now of course war is not necessary, violence is not necessary, we don't need to use arms and so on. And I think the tragedy of what's happened in Ukraine just highlights for us yet again the kind of world, unfortunately, in which we live. So let me just make a few very quick comments about the just war tradition and how it might be applied in the current context, and then I'll sit down. So the just war tradition goes back a long way in Christian thinking, not least to St. Augustine around the 4th century. It was taken up by the great medieval scholar Thomas Aquinas, and through his work and the work of many other people in the Middle Ages and beyond, became the dominant position within these most Christian denominations over the course of history. In the last century or so, there have been notable Christian theologians and ethicists who have advocated the just war position. Reinhold Niebuhr, for example, in the United States, at the time of the Second World War, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who condoned the assassination or the attempted assassination of Hitler, the evangelical ethicist, though I don't know if he calls himself evangelical anymore, David Gushee in the United States, and Nigel Bigger, who is Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at Oxford, who I had the pleasure of meeting some years ago, who's written a big book called In Defence of War. I have to say I don't agree with all of what he says, not least his attempt to justify the invasion of Iraq, I should say. But it's an immensely rich book, and anyone interested in the subject of war and the principles of just war really needs to read his work. Over the centuries, various principles have been developed. I've outlined some of those here. There are principles that apply to the conditions under which a war people may resort to war. There must be a just cause, there must be just a right intention, there must be a clear desire to re-establish peace. The war should be a last resort after sort of everything else has failed. It needs to be waged by legitimate authority, a state, and there should be a reasonable chance of success. So a thermonuclear war in which you blow everyone up and there's nothing left would not be consistent with that principle. And in addition, the principles regarding the regulation of the conduct of war is embodied in international humanitarian law. That's what IHL stands for. So, and that includes that the war must be conducted on a proportional basis. The proportional principle, incidentally, is one of the really, really difficult ones to apply. Happy to think about that in questions if people have any. The war must be discriminate in the sense that non-combatants should not be deliberately targeted, and there should be clarity around where responsibility for war lies. And if I could just conclude by reading part of a statement from David Gushee about the war between Russia and Ukraine as he applies these principles to that context, to that conflict. He says, on the Russian side, this is one of the clearest real-life examples of an unjust war I have encountered in life and study. And he's an expert actually on the Second World War, among other things. In classic war terms, Russia is obviously wrong, both in initiating this war, no just cause, no right intention, and in how it is waging the war, violations of proportionality and of the rules of war, such as indiscriminate shelling of population centres. Likewise, Ukraine clearly is acting in a morally justifiable manner, both in defending itself, just cause, right intention, legitimate authority, etc., and as far as I can see so far, in how it has defended itself. This he wrote a few weeks ago, maybe it doesn't apply anymore. Ukraine is fighting, in his view, a just war. There is no reason for cynicism about the motives of Ukraine's government or the conduct of its soldiers and people. There is no beast at work in Kiev. This is a people defending itself, led by a government doing government's most sacred task, protecting its people. It is an absolute tragedy. We are just so thankful, I think, that we are 17,000 kilometers away. We are not on the borders of Ukraine. We are not in Ukraine. We are not refugees from Ukraine. But we are all bound together in our common humanity. And I, for one, have found these last 2 months very painful, deeply disturbing, and very worrying in terms of what the future may hold. Can I just finally conclude with a few words from Psalm 31? One of the senior rabbis in Ukraine last week asked the world community of Jews and Christians and anyone else of goodwill to pray in solidarity with the Ukrainian people the ancient lament which constitutes Psalm 31. I won't read it all, I'll just read a few lines. Let your face shine on your servant. Save me in your unfailing love. Let me not be put to shame, Lord, for I have cried out to you. But let the wicked be put to shame and be silent in the realm of the dead. Let their lying lips be silenced, for with pride and contempt they speak arrogantly against the righteous. Praise be to the Lord, for he has shown the wonders of his love when I was in a city under siege. The Lord preserves those who are true to him, but the proud he pays back in full. Be strong and take heart, all you who hope in the Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Jonathan. It doesn't quite feel right. Such a somber presentation. We have about 25 minutes for questions. I see I skipped some slides. I'm sorry, Jonathan. I wonder if, before getting into questions from the crowd online and off, whether any of you presenters have queries for each other.
I did forget one thing, and I'm not going to read it. For those of you who have the handout, it's the words of Abraham Lincoln, and I'm sorry, they are profoundly significant in this context. And can I read them out? Because, did you have them up? Did people see them?
I did not have them up.
Yes, well, it's just, I think this really captures brilliantly, I think, a very Christian perspective on how we should view war. He says, with malice towards none, with charity for all, including Vladimir Putin, and John rightly reminds us of his humanity, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, and it highlights the ambiguity that, Maty was referring to. Things aren't frequently black and white. There's lots of shades of grey. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in and to bind up the nation's wounds. Well, just think of the enormous binding of wounds in Ukraine and indeed in Russia. To care for him who has borne the battle and her, and for his widow or widower and his orphan or her orphan. And there'll be lots of grieving mothers and fathers and grandparents all over. And to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. I mean, I don't know if any of you have been to the Lincoln Memorial and stood and read these words. These are profoundly significant.
Thank you.
John, it looked like you might have had a query for one of your compatriots. Sorry.
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Shall we go to Meeting Pulse then and see how this works? Mika,
Yes.
do you have any questions on that forum that you want to feed in?
I might throw this one to you regarding sort of the history and sort of comparing the current situation in history. Is this whole situation analogous to the time when Hitler began invading Germany's lands at the start of World War II? And could this be the beginning of World War III?
I think we are in very different circumstances. And earlier I mentioned that there is a school of thought of people of neocons who try to more look at the psychological aspect of leaders instead of thinking what's really behind. And I think it's too early to say, but personally, I don't think that's the case. We have to see what else is, involved. It's too early to jump, and I don't have a crystal ball, so I'm not that sure about that. Does it answer your question?
Yeah.
Maybe John
I think,
has.
I think it's interesting, the rhetoric. I mean, you don't want to translate rhetoric or confuse rhetoric and action or capacity for action, but the rhetoric has certainly been leveraged up in the nuclear possibility. So Mr. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, specifically called out that possibility and said it was more likely. You'll have seen that there was a British minister, I can't think who it was now, but it doesn't matter, in the last day or so, who said that he thought it would be fine if missiles that had been sent by Britain to help Ukraine were fired at Russian targets.
He's one of the ministers of defence.
That's right. And you've seen the response from Mr. Putin that there would be a lightning response, whatever that means. So what I'd say is that the rhetoric is getting more pronounced in that space. Do I think it will actually result in World War III? No, I don't. Do I think that the rhetoric and the capability are necessarily matched? No, I don't. So I'm not overly anxious, but you do need to watch it.
And I would also add that it's not sure that countries like Germany and France are ready for a third world war. On the continent, it's another aspect to take into account. But I must say there are lots of testosterone going on during this war.
I felt that myself. I hearing Zelensky, I feel like if I didn't have children, a wife, I feel like I'd almost want to zoom over there.
Yeah.
I never thought that was possible.
No.
Mika, do you want to chime another one in if there is?
Yeah, I'll put one to you, Joan, about New Zealand's response.
Yeah.
Quite a simple short one. Should New Zealand stop buying Russian oil?
Yes, is the short answer to that. It's a bit more complicated because we don't know whether our oil is Russian or not, or whether Russian oil has got into our oil stream before it gets to us. So I'm not sure how easy it is for us to stop buying Russian oil. But certainly, I think that one of the consequences of this for Russia in the long term will be that Western Europe and I think supporting countries work very, very hard to move from their reliance on gas and oil from Russia. And whether that means they substitute with nuclear or whatever they do, I think they'll be really fit in that space. I mean, looking at it now from Russia's perspective, it hasn't been a hugely fantastic thing, has it? I mean, it's apart from the destruction that's been talked about, we've got Sweden and Finland now talking about joining NATO. We're not talking about, in the process of joining NATO. We've got sanctions on Russia, including people beginning to reject their gas and oil, which will have profound effects on their economy going forward. There's been significant death associated with their invasion of their own troops and people. And remember that many Russian families have relatives and associations in Ukraine.
And vice versa.
And the other ones, that's what I was about to say. So it is an absurd and tragic thing. And the judgments, whatever the rationale, the judgments that have led to this were flat out wrong.
We have a question from the room.
I'm not sure whether this is a question, but more like my feeling for the speeches, all the talks in here. Firstly, I don't agree with any invasion. I don't approve it because I'm peace activist. I'm basically against all wars. But for this situation, for this war, I don't really know why US think they have the right or they are the one point fingers. Because they are the one, as we can see from passing the anti-terrorism thing starting after 9/11, and there are 6 major warfares. And I think we all know most of the invasion American does without much justification. So for them to point finger at Russia, I think they are the last person who should do that. And then secondly, they were talking about war crime. Look what they do with Assange, Julian Assange and Snowden, who are those exposed the American war crimes, but look what happened to them. So it's a lot of hypocrisy here. And then I will say, well, Russia, even for the invasion, okay, I think Russia has more than 10 good reasons. If people do a good reading about why they feel they have to do that, they're much more justified than what Americans do when they go to invest in other countries. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do. It's certainly not a best thing to do. And especially after that happens, it's like what Americans do. Is that helping? No, they just make situation get worse and worse. And that what they do is not helping. And because I'm Taiwanese, I know what they do between how they provoke Chinese, how they agree with one China policy, but then on the other hand, agree Taiwanese separates to go independence and keep selling you overpriced useless weapons to fight China. So I don't really agree because most of the time, American, their arms dealer are the ones who benefit most. Whole lot of the other industry, they benefit most from the warfare around the world. And a whole lot of war, they are either behind it or they are supplying things to make things worse. And I can't see why they are doing, and they are the one also control all the narrative, the worldwide sort of media. And I was like, hey, if you really read enough, you will know the same thing. America wouldn't let it happen in their own backyard or front yard or wherever neighboring country. Imagine if other people do that to them, what they will do, they will destroy you for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, and the last one, just the last one, because Professor mentioned about outside of Parliament, and I would suggest everybody, because I was there 23 days in the Parliament 30s. So I would suggest you, don't just believe what you see on TV. I was there every day. I know what's really happening.
Well, I was there quite often
there
too.
are a lot of,
But
I
not on
was
your
there
side,
10
I'm sorry.
hours a day, so don't tell me you know what's happening. Okay?
And-
There are hate things happen there, and the media was censored, controlled, and
maybe we should.
yeah,
park
okay.
the,
All I'm saying is that if anybody wants to really find out, do make an effort. Okay?
Certainly.
The truth is not what you see on the major TV news.
But I wonder if we can let the speakers respond to some of the comments about USA and are they in the right place to point any fingers?
Well, I think if you start with the premise that this is an unjustified war, and I accept that's not where you've started, but nonetheless, I think it is the position that, as we saw in the United Nations, most countries in the world take. If you start from that premise, then the question is, what is the appropriate response of non-participant countries to that reality? So is it legitimate for other countries, whether they're the US or any other country, to support Ukraine? Or effectively, on your thesis, does Ukraine have to, notwithstanding it's been unjustifiably invaded, does it have to stand alone? And I think the answer to that in most people's minds would be that if it is unjustified, then there is a legitimacy in supporting the Ukrainian response. And that,
better.
well, it makes it, well, potentially yes. I mean, it depends if you believe that it is better for the Ukrainians to be entitled to their sovereignty and their culture and their dignity in their place. So I'm not debating it with you. I'm just explaining that would be the perspective. So
yeah, I could debate in every area this year for next
Absolutely.
hour, but I won't.
Perhaps have a wine.
Everybody's-
yeah, with the wine out. Yeah. So
John, did you have a, I'm sorry.
my point is that I in my mind, the US supporting Ukraine, while I think there is an issue about proxy war, and I think that is a legitimate lens to bring to it, I think a proportionate level of support is appropriate.
Well, then I'm really worried about the future of this world now. If everybody trying to justify the war.
I think we all are.
Yeah,
John.
I just want to say something, you said the war is unjustified, and I agree, but I want to give you the Russian perspective when you say it's unprovoked. In 2014, there was a coup in Maidan, and Yanukovych, who was the democratically elected president of Ukraine, he may have been corrupt, had to flee to Russia.
He didn't have to flee. He chose to flee.
Yeah, okay. He chose
He
to flee.
chose to
Yeah,
flee.
but
So
the
let's
point
get
is-
the facts straight.
Point
All
is,
right.
yeah, okay, a democratically elected government was overthrown, and the US is not supposed to support, democratically overthrown government. And so when you say Zelensky's a democratically elected president of Ukraine, from the Russian perspective, I'm not saying I agree with it. From the Russian perspective, it was very much provoked because the government was overthrown. They moved into Crimea, and then from their perspective, from the Russian perspective, the war started in 2014 because there was all this conflict in Donbass, which was not covered in the Western media, and this is just an escalation of an existing conflict. And we should remember that President Zelensky was elected on the premise that he was going to bring peace to eastern Ukraine and he was going to implement the Minsk Accords, which he didn't. So I'm not saying I agree with this, but from the Russian perspective, it's, to me, I said this to Maty last night, if you jump on the tail of the tiger, you're a bit naive if you think the tiger isn't going to react.
Yeah.
Agree, but if the panelists agree with me, so because having worked in Russia for 15 years, Mr. Putin doesn't know the word reverse. There's no such thing in his book because it's just, I've spoke to Russian friends, there's no way they're going to reverse. So he has to be given an out and saying, put him on trial in The Hague, well, that would be at the end of World War III, wouldn't it? Because there's no way he's going to reverse. It's just not in this.
Can I just say, it raises the question about how
Yeah.
you create space for reversal in the midst of war.
Good point.
And I'm no expert on diplomacy or international relations, peacemaking, I'm sorry, but I understand the point you're making, but I frankly just don't see how the rest of the world creates space for some kind of
Well, they could start by saying that Ukraine is neutral. I mean, to me, you said it was unprovoked. From the Russian perspective, saying we're going to join NATO was a provocation. As Maty mentioned, NATO wasn't supposed to be expanding, so this is a provocation.
Yeah.
So that could be a starting point that Ukraine signs a pact to not join NATO, for example.
yes, which I gather it's more or less said now.
So why didn't you say that before the war started to save all the lives of these people?
Well, look, I'm not here to defend the Ukrainian president, but Ukraine was not a member of NATO when Putin invaded. And in fact,
It signed an agreement in December, a few months before. Sorry, it signed a partnership agreement in December of 2021 to a path to NATO membership. So it was on track towards.
yes, but it hadn't been agreed.
I know, but
Come on,
Russia
you
had said
can't
that's a
wait
red
for it.
line for about 5 years. That is a red line, that if you do this, we're going to invade. So from their point of view, a red line had been crossed. I'm not saying I agree with it,
Sure.
but it's.
What about this question of, for Maty or John, perhaps, of what could be a way out for Putin? As opposed to, I guess, what I understand Biden's line at the moment of it's talking about war crimes and things. What is an alternative to that kind of rhetoric?
What do you think, John? I wish I had a crystal ball. My feeling is that neither of these great powers, I mean, I'm talking about the United States and Putin, who is resurrecting, Russia to come back as a great power. None of them want to lose face, so it's going to be complicated, and I guess sacrifices have to be made. in this case. So John mentioned, Ukraine making some compromises, but I'm not an expert on that either. I'm not an
But the
expert
other
on
thing we
Russia.
could do is say a referendum in Crimea, and if that supervised by the United Nations, and if that says we want to be part of Russia, let Crimea be part of Russia. But Ukraine's position is
No way.
no
Yeah.
compromise, no way. But 80% of the population of Crimea is Russian. And even if you had a fair election, they'd probably vote to be with Russia. I have a friend from Odessa who told me he hopes that Odessa is Russian because the quality of life of his elderly mother will improve and it would be better than the failed government they have now. So one thing I wanted to say, it's not 100% of Ukrainians. The majority of Ukrainians want a Western future.
That's right.
But there are some Ukrainians who feel much closer to Russia. So it's a mistake of the media to paint it in black and white. Most want, but not all want. There's 12 million.
But as you know, I mean, so that I understand the point. It's a fair point. But equally, at the time, in 1992, when they established Ukraine and the new guys, there was a referendum, as you know, and it was what 92%, something. It was extremely high percentage, including from the Russian-controlled areas, Russian-speaking areas, wanted independence. So I'm not arguing with your proposition. I agree with it in many respects, but it's not as if those tests haven't been taken in the process thus far.
Andrew.
Not sure which one we can answer this one. There's evidence to suggest that the surrounding Eastern European countries, as evident from presidential elections in Hungary, Serbia, tends to be a bit more pro-Russian because they tend to be a bit more anti-NATO. Particularly for Serbia, that perception of NATO has been shaped by the 1999 war. So I suppose my question is, how can NATO change the perception of these Eastern European nations? Perhaps help them to understand, to see NATO not as a threat, but as a partner.
I haven't got an easy answer for you on that. I think, if you think about a lot of those countries joined NATO in this triumphalist period when they genuinely thought they'd ended history. So they thought they'd won. So they didn't think there was a need to be able to explain because they thought it was self-evident because their view of the world had prevailed. Manifestly, that was wrong then and it's wrong now. But I'm not sure that they've adapted in terms of their thinking to address the challenge that you've put, which I think is a fair one. So I think there's a lot of work to do if NATO's going to do what you've described.
Mikko, I realise I've been neglecting the online people. Do you have anything from Meeting Pulse?
Yeah, there's one here which I'll put to you, Jonathan. What would a pacifist response to Putin's invasion look like and what could it achieve?
Well, I think if it was a genuinely pacifist response, it would have to be a non-violent response. So it would mean Ukraine essentially allowing Russia to take over the country. There would be legitimacy from a pacifist position in passive non-violent resistance. So it would be justified for civilians to lie down in front of tanks.
That's not true.
Please, can you let me finish? I'm sorry. It would be justified to take strike action, so industrial action of that kind. It might be justified in taking other kinds of measures of a non-violent nature, but in effect, it would not permit any kind of taking up of force, weapons to stop. I'm sorry, but I did want to try and just finish my answer, please. If you have a further response, that's in the hands of the chair.
May I ask you something, Jonathan? Does your pacifism also include negotiation? So that you don't offer yourself to as a belligerent country, but you try to negotiate. Does it enter in this framework? Yes.
If there was the opportunity for negotiation, but if you're dealing with, forgive me, an aggressor of the kind that we now have in Russia, there may be no scope for negotiation. We have to think about the context and whether or not one side is willing to respect the dignity and rights of the other. And if you're invading and you're prepared to kill people, probably you're not. I mean, think about Mahatma Gandhi, for example. The interesting thing is that he was never killed. So he survived and was able to pursue a strategy of non-violent resistance. I suspect if Hitler had been the leader of the British Empire, he would have been long gone. Now, that's not to say that the British Empire was squeaky clean or anything like that. On the contrary, I mean, they did some dreadful things, and they were an empire, and they took over countries willy-nilly. But they were willing to negotiate with him in a way that maybe others weren't. So context is critically important. I don't know what Putin is willing to contemplate by way of negotiations, seriously. I really don't. My impression is that he would prefer to have the whole of Ukraine as part of Russia. And it may be that nothing short of that will satisfy him. If that's the case, then the risk is you have a very long, dreadful conflict with absolutely tragic consequences, as we're witnessing.
We have come to time. I'd love to keep talking, but I think we should honour the time. Please join with me in thanking our speakers this evening.
We're planning to run other events. I'm not sure exactly what events. This is one that I feel like it's got quite a lot of energy at the moment. I'm hearing a lot of people talking about should one bring babies into this troubled world. I feel like we're going to have quite a good conversation about that. But maybe it's too dark or too hot. Who knows? Mika's got a sign-up form. If you're interested in hearing about other events or suggesting topics, please sign that on your way up. And please feel free to finish off the rest of the wine and snacks. And God bless you all.
Thank you.